3/4 of an hour. But next, we'll be looking at labels in Food for Thought.
Once again, good of you to come to our second of our food labelling courses. What we're going to do tonight...
An adult education course on food labelling, the first of its kind in the country.
Over here.
In Essex, course lecturer John Downey is guiding people through the maze of regulations governing what we eat and the descriptions of food attached to food products.
Very good! Very good.
The success of the course reflects the growing interest in the exact composition of foodstuffs.
This is one of the few products that is totally and absolutely exactly as it was given by the animal. The cow gives the milk. All that happens to it is that it's heat treated, and we'll talk about what that is in a moment, and you are presented with a product as it came from the cow. Nothing added, nothing taken away. All that's happened is...
The fact that a course like this is necessary is evidence of how complicated the subject itself is. So I asked John Downey how it all started.
After doing one or two one-night stands at women's groups, men's groups, this sort of thing, I realised there was a great interest in food labelling, and I just wanted to take it to a wider audience if at all possible. And this is how it's developed, really. We've got now a course that's viable and working. And if there are more people, we'll do another one.
Has it really been a successful course?
I think so. I think it's opened people's eyes and given them a sort of broad outline of what food labelling is all about and how they can differentiate between one product and another.
John's spoken tonight on sausages, yoghurts, which is normally in my shopping once a week, and I feel that as far as the sausages go, I was a person that bought beef and pork, and now I don't look at them at all because the meat content doesn't have to be as high as when you have just all the pork. And I think tins I do take more note. Don't you feel that you...
Yes, I feel that it's created an awareness in me.
It has done?
Yes, I think that if that is all John has achieved, that's what he wanted to achieve, probably. We are more aware now.
Is that true of you too?
Yes, in fact, it makes shopping a little bit more interesting as well, because, you know, you're not just picking things up blindly as before, you are looking and hopefully buying better.
Shopping for food is not what it was. Gone are the days when you might pop around the corner for some bacon, half a dozen eggs, flour and a sliced loaf. The corner shop now has a greater range and variety of new foods than ever before. Supermarkets like this are becoming daily more and more complicated. And at the same time as the range of our food has increased, so too has our interest in what is actually in our food.
In this series, we've been looking at the many aspects of how we can eat in a healthier way. And crucial to that is knowing exactly what we are eating. In tonight's programme, we're going to be looking at the composition and the labelling of food. How do we know what's what? What should we be looking for? And what are the food producers doing to help us in our search to find out? The whole area of food regulations and what can and can't be said is controlled by the government, and in particular the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. They are responsible for updates and amendments to food legislation, although much has changed as a result of our commitment to Europe, in particular an improvement in labelling.
Well, for about 10 years we've been negotiating, the UK has, with the EEC for EC-wide labelling regulations, and they finally came into force in this country in January of '83. And so now we are seeing on food, processed prepackaged food, far more information than we've ever had before, and that's a very big step forward for ordinary people. The information is important in the sense that it gives us more about ingredients, gives us date marking, which was voluntarily put on by some people but not mandatory. It gives us information about additives, and all in all adds greatly to the information. But problem is. How many people can really use it? Because a lot of the information is rather difficult to understand.
So a processed, packaged product like this now carries some basic information. Firstly, a sell-by date. And secondly, a list of ingredients in descending order of amount. These contain water, turkey, rusk, beef and sugar, although we don't know how much fat is hidden in the meat. And there are other problems with labelling too.
I think some of the labelling regulations are terribly inadequate. I mean, let me explain, for instance, the distinction between, say, chocolate flavour and chocolate flavoured. Now, those two words sound very similar, they mean entirely different things. If the product on the label says chocolate flavoured, it means it's got a flavour which resembles chocolate and at least some way derives from chocolate. If it says, on the other hand, chocolate flavour, this means it's got a flavour which is supposed to resemble chocolate, but has never come anywhere near a chocolate source. Now, I think that labelling is designed actually to be misleading, and effectively is misleading, and I think that's one of many things that I think needs changing and reforming.
However tasty this strawberry supreme delight may be, it has no real strawberries in it, only a strawberry flavour. Popular milk drinks are another example. This strawberry flavour milk is high on added sugar, colouring and salt, but has no real fruit. And what exactly is a glass of orange? A carton that claims to be pure orange juice has to contain just that, while the main ingredient in this orange drink is water with orange juice as well as sweeteners and flavouring. This whole orange drink contains the orange flesh, pith and peel, as well as sugar, syrup and sweeteners. This fizzy orangeade is largely carbonated water with sweeteners and flavouring. But some products, like this yoghurt, actually give more information than the legal minimum. It includes the nutritional composition, which some people argue should by law be put on every product.
There is no requirement at all for general foods to give information about the nutritional content. So we can't find out the amount of fat, the amount of sugar, the amount of salt that is in the food that we're eating. And this is quite important. For example, in a supermarket, when we're surrounded by tins and bottles and packages, you can pick up common foods like baked beans, which contains quite an amount of sugar, and in the label it just lists sugar as one of the ingredients. We also pick up foods which are offered as sort of healthy breakfast cereals, and they will contain a list of their ingredients as well. And this one, for example, has sugar divided into 4 different categories: brown sugar, sugar, honey and malt, at different positions in the list. Now, I don't know how much sugar is in there, but there's obviously quite a lot, and there's 4 different sorts. We have no idea. In common meat products, where we expect there to be some fat, if you look at the list of ingredients here, it also has salt and sugar. We have no idea how much fat, no idea of the amount of sugar or salt. That would be useful if we're trying to reduce the amount of fat or sugar in our diet. But in this country, very different from the rest of the common market, with cheeses, we have a particular problem that there's no amount of information at all required on the amount of fat in cheeses. And Britain's very own new cheese, Limeswold, actually has 70% of fat in its dry matter, and no information for the consumer. So it's a very high-fat cheese, but we can't tell.
Most traditional cheeses are in fact high in fat. Cheddar, for example, contains as much as 40%. But in Britain, cheeses are exempt from having their components listed, so there's no information about fat content, although low-fat cheeses are developing into a new market.
I think manufacturers now are quite worried about the new drive to have more information, more nutritional information on labels, because they know that consumers will change many of the choices they make in the supermarket. I think sugar and fat is classic examples where people would make different choices, and they're worried.
One of the reasons that food manufacturers used to give for not putting lists of ingredients on the labels of their products was that people really wouldn't be interested. But how true is that nowadays? I called into a supermarket just north of London, and the people I spoke to there made it quite plain that they are concerned about the labels, and it has altered the way in which they choose food products. Particularly high on their list of concerns are things like preservatives and chemical additives. You were looking quite closely at the labels when you were shopping. Are they important to you?
Yes, on everyday products they are. Things that I would use sort of constantly, like things for sandwiches, and things for breakfast cereals, yes, I'm very concerned. The odd treat that we have, things like lemonade, biscuits and sweets, I'm not so concerned about, but as they're sort of fairly rare treats, I think it sort of tends to find a pretty medium balance for things.
How long have you been looking at food labels closely?
I'd say about the last 12 months, really, sort of with the influx in magazines about it, especially the ladies' magazines, they're sort of saying beware of fat contents and all this sort of jazz and things. So yes, I would say the last 12 months I've been quite...
And how much real difference has that made to the way that you choose your food?
Quite a lot, in that I have to come to a large store like this to actually get it. If you go to the local supermarket, they tend to keep a very limited range of stuff, especially things like breakfast cereals and biscuits and bread. You tend to sort of get the white standard stodgy loaf, and that's it. There's no choice of getting wholemeal loaves, so that has altered my shopping.
I tend to look for the fresh fruit and fresh produce, so I know it hasn't got preservatives in and this sort of thing. I'm not one to fill myself up with chemicals which are being produced, but just for the sake of it, I prefer to get something fresh. And therefore I tend, if there's a choice between a fresh product and a preserved product, then I'll go for the fresh product and not even bother looking at the preserved product.
What do you find yourself looking for most important on a food label that gives ingredients?
Additives such as colouring and preservative mainly, and also looking for salt as well. I don't like too much salt in food.
I do try and pick things that don't have too much colouring or flavouring or preservative, but it is difficult if you're buying convenience foods. I think the best bet are cheeses and yoghurts and natural foods. I don't eat meat, so I get away from things in that line. So it is quite easy.
What do you feel about the kind of information that's on labels? Would you like to change that in some way if you could?
I think a lot of it is not as full as it could be. When you see things like flavouring E120 or preservative P34, it does tend to make you think, well, what is it really?
This government booklet, Look at the Label, is the essential guide to some of the most common food additives. Manufacturers are now permitted to use over 3,000 of them, including flavours, thickeners, emulsifiers and sweeteners, as well as preservatives. The new E numbers are codes for the additives which are most commonly used here and in Europe. There is concern about the growing number of additives that is now used in our food products, although some people believe that we could worry too much.
Now, if somebody suggests that you use a food additive, whether it is to keep the food moist, whether it is to preserve it, though the number of preservatives for this is very few, whether it is to colour it and make it attractive, these are examined till the cows come home. And the slightest sniff of scandal, out they go. But, hang on, this is the point I'm making, you don't mind hanging on. The point is, naturally occurring in food are all sorts of toxic substances. Potatoes, if potatoes were imported for the first time from South America by Sir Walter Raleigh or Sir Francis Drake, I never can remember who it was, they wouldn't be allowed for a moment. They contain solanine. And if they contained only about 5 times as much as they do, they would be actively poisonous. Now, I'm not suggesting that potatoes are poisonous, but there they contain these. Horseradish. Why do you think if you take too much horseradish sauce with your roast beef, all that perspiration comes out on your body? They contain nitrogen mustard. Now, suppose I suggested nitrogen mustard be added, in Pike's plump patent food. I wouldn't be allowed to do it, would I? And almost rhubarb, it contains oxalic acid. And in World War I, when their food policy wasn't half as good, and anything like as good, they hadn't got the knowledge, somebody or other, the Minister of Food in World War I, when they were short of cabbages, suggested that people should eat the leaves of rhubarb, and several people died.
Our average intake of additives, though, is rapidly increasing. It's estimated to be the equivalent of 12 aspirin-sized tablets a day, or over 4 pounds a year. Is it necessary for processed food these days to contain chemicals on such a scale?
Well, my view on that would be different from food manufacturers' view. Food manufacturers would argue that it might be possible to trim a number of colourings and flavourings, although they would also say that consumers won't buy peas, for instance, if they're not artificially coloured. And they'll quote one particular trial that was done in a major food store that showed that if they stop colouring the peas, people buy less of them. But on the other hand, in France, where no peas are coloured, people still buy peas. It's a question of what you're used to. So it's a question of what you consider necessary. If you consider it necessary for manufacturers' sales, then you'd say what? all additives are all right. They're all justified by the fact they help to keep food safe and food prices down. But I would say that if people were to adopt a diet that in any case would be healthier by using more natural foods, then they would dramatically cut the number of additives, and really there would be very few additives that are necessary, apart from possibly a few preservatives.
Many firms are now capitalizing on the increasing interest in more natural foods. Nuts and grain are being used by Jordan's in Hertfordshire to make a new range of breakfast cereals and snack bars. Though high in sugar content, they are free from chemical additives, and their success is evidence of the growing fashion for health foods.
We don't have any preservatives in the products, we don't add anything, and we have to look after our products, and we're very concerned with how we keep them. Our packaging certainly has best before dates, where we have a 20-week shelf life, and it's important that the products are recycled by the supermarkets and by the health food shops together, so that the products are fresh when the customer gets them. We obviously work quite closely as to the different regulations you have to put on the packaging, but mainly it is having the best before dates that people need to understand and they need to learn to look at, because it is important. The food does go off, it's not preserved, and it's important that people do understand that.
The advertising that Jordan's use seeks to link the product directly with good health, although that in itself is nothing new in food advertising.
Every product liked to produce all kinds of claims. The forerunners to this were the medicinal ones, where everything cured everything else. But there were quite a number of things where, for instance, with this Cerebos one, it wasn't just dainty for the table, but it contains the food strength of bran. It makes children grow to full height. It gives strength to overworked adults. It makes richer blood and stronger nerves. It is a food, not a medicine. It is used by thousands of doctors, and it is the daintiest, driest, finest salt. Never gets lumpy, requires no crushing or preparation for use. You know, it does everything for you.
And that's simply salt as a product?
That's simple salt. I mean, another one, Carr's Scotch Oaten. This leaflet, in fact, includes a medical analyst's report. This food has all the excellent properties of the best oatmeal without possessing any of its objectionable qualities. And then they go on to say, Scotch Oaten is prepared from the finest selected Scotch oats by a special process whereby all husk and indigestible fibre is removed. It promotes the growth of bone and is a most nutritious and easily digested food for all classes, especially children and invalids. In this Quaker Oats one, to housewives who regard purity, simplicity and healthfulness as prime requisites of food, who desire a variety of delicate and appetizing dishes and wish to avoid unwholesome and injurious foods, we recommend Quaker Oats as being more economical and healthful than meats. Doctors, nurses and specialists strongly recommend a more generous use of it.
There may be nothing very new about the relationship in people's minds between good food and good health, but compositional standards are a much more recent development. Within the last 100 years, milk was systematically watered down, alum was added to sugar, and ground chalk went to bulk out plain flour. It was for that reason that legally enforceable standards of purity were first introduced. A good example of products which have strict compositional standards are the fats. Margarine, for example, must have a minimum fat content of 80%. So the new low-fat spreads cannot actually be called margarines because they don't meet that standard. Meat products also have strict compositional standards, but there's plenty of argument from the food manufacturers now about whether they are still as relevant as they once were.
So manufacturers claim that compositional standards aren't needed so much anymore. They believe that they restrict their ability to develop new products, and they say that so long as food is clearly labelled, then the law could be relaxed. Of course, it's the manufacturers who have to keep within the law, so it's not surprising to find that those who disagree with them are the people who have to enforce the law. Public officials believe that any trade-off between better labelling and a relaxation of compositional legal standards is not necessarily in the public interest.
Now, in the last 20 years, the fish content of a fish finger has gone down from 80% down to 50%, quite simply because there's been no food standard in there for it, which is one of the reasons why we are calling for food standards for fish fingers. There's a good example of what happens when you haven't got a food standard. So I think if you withdrew food standards generally, then there would be a move towards debasement. And if you think about the pressures that the larger retailers place on manufacturers, where they buy at the keenest possible prices, then obviously manufacturers, whilst they might not want to move into the area of dropping meat contents or dropping fish contents, whatever it might be, that's the sort of thing that unfortunately commercial pressure brings without the backstop, as it were, of food compositional standards.
So manufacturers can put as little fish in fish fingers as they want without having to tell you. There are stricter controls on meat products, but even then, processed meats are allowed to contain a wide range of ingredients. And what legally is permitted to be described as meat itself is much broader than most people imagine.
There are parts of the carcasses of animals that I don't think the general public would regard as meat. Rind being used in fairly large proportions, connective tissue, gristle and things like that being ground down into a fine slurry so that they can be used in those sort of products. And at the same time there's been the development of new machines for getting off the bones of all sorts of animals, chickens, turkeys, pigs, sheep, lambs, as well as beef, able to extract all the meat off the bone, and then again that's in the form of a slurry. So all those things are being used in the meat product, and the analyst he tests for nitrogen, and from finding nitrogen he gets an apparent meat content. So he doesn't know whether it's come from mechanically recovered meat or not.
Are you saying that all those things are in contravention of the food standards?
No. The definition, this is one of our greatest problems, is the wide definition of meat. It allows, for example, meat to include fat, any amount of fat, and then things like skin and gristle in amounts naturally associated with the meat. Now, the only place that you can really enforce that at the present time is in the factory, because the analyst can't tell the differences between all those things, whether they're naturally associated with the meat. In the laboratory, he just gets what appears to be an apparent meat content.
Actually, it's the Environmental Health Officer from the Council. I've actually purchased this food for the purposes of analysis. And what I've got to do, in accordance with the Food and Drugs Act, is divide it into 3 parts. A little later on, I'd like your name just for the record, and also need to know where the food came from, the meat, where it's bought from. But in the meantime, can we take this somewhere where I can divide it up into 3 parts and put it into jars?
Jeff Fish was alerted by the claim that the burgers were 100% pure beef. To check it out, he takes formal samples from the burgers he's just bought, seals them into jars there and then, to be sent to the public analyst for chemical tests. Salisbury's claim in this case was accurate, but routine check calls like this are an important part of the work of local councils. Throughout the country, they're on the lookout for misleading claims, adulterated and unsafe food, or occasionally downright illegal food frauds. It was in 1980 that Jeff Fish and his colleagues really hit the headlines. They unearthed a scandal that was to have repercussions around the world. It started with a tip-off that all wasn't quite well in a pet food factory, which then stood on this building site in Fulham. It turned out to be the front for a multi-million-pound operation selling rotten meat, including kangaroos, for human consumption all around the country. And it took an unusually dramatic plan to catch the villains.
The only way we could really check on it was to do a sort of Sweeney Todd-style surveillance thing, which we'd never done anything like it before. We had unmarked cars, 3-hour shifts for officers, two-way radios, and all sorts of things like this. Some of our colleagues thought we were going over the top when we were doing it, but it did show us, in fact, that knacker meat, unfit meat, horse meat, was coming into the premises. We decided we'd have to raid the premises, so we got the local police to support us and went in en masse. And in fact, we found about 30 tons of unfit meat on the premises, which we seized. And in fact, that was later condemned by a magistrate. And it took us about 6 months to thoroughly investigate with the paperwork all the packages of meat that had gone out from the premises over the previous period. And it had gone nationwide, and later on, in fact, had some meat tested that we'd seized from the premises, found it to be kangaroo meat. I mean, they were even importing kangaroo meat and putting that in with all the rest. I mean, it didn't matter what it was. Once it was frozen in a block, then the manufacturers and the inspectors couldn't tell. It's just a frosted top. It's not until you defrost it that you see the sort of feces, the glass, the string, the muck, and the abscesses and things like that.
How much money was being made out of it?
Millions. Millions. I mean, the ripples of our investigation in this country went across the world. The Americans started looking at their beef imports and found that they were getting kangaroo from Australia. And that they actually banned all Australian beef for a period, which caused apoplexy in Australia. And in fact, they introduced a Royal Commission, new legislation, but all around the world this has been exposed.
Well, that was presumably a fairly extreme case. You must be concerned with more routine matters as well, though. Tell me about the survey that you did on mince.
Now, on mince, I think it was in 1982, yes, we did a survey because we were getting the impression that mince described as beef very often contained other meats, and we wanted to sort of find out what was happening. So in fact, we took a large number of samples in West London. It was a coordinated thing with a lot of London boroughs. And in fact, it was quite disturbing what we found. We found that the mince contained large amounts of fat, up to sort of 35–40% in some cases. The relationship between the price and the fat content, there was no relationship. And in addition, a large number of samples which are described as beef mince, superior, steak mince, these kind of descriptions, in fact contained other meats.
Their investigation led to a Government Food Standards Committee report, and legislation is now in the pipeline which will insist that the fat content of mince is displayed. Other work involves keeping an eye on new meat products.
Here, there's been a terrific rise in these things called quick steaks, and there's one here called 4 beef quick steaks chopped and shaped. Now, that indicates to me, the word steak to me is a thick cut of meat, not chopped up. So the words chopped and shaped are a contradiction. Beef, in fact, this product contains other meats as well. And also, it's a product which contains soya, it contains wheat gluten, binders, chemicals, additives of all kinds, as in fact a macerated product, more like a patty. And we think this should be called a savoury meat croquette, something like that. But again, there are always arguments in labelling as to the actual designation on the packet of what people are buying.
Between 1/3 and 1/4 of all the food we eat now is cooked and served away from home.
You get the 2 12s here for the top tier. Yeah, that's not 2 11s. Yeah. What do you want up there? 2 11s? 2 11?
It's in this area of eating out that we can find ourselves eating food the quality of which we know relatively little about, despite elaborately worded menus and ostentatious presentation.
Chef, some sauce here. Some sauce.
What are you going to start with? You're going to have the...
I'm having real game soup, please.
Real game soup. I think I'll have the Cornish crab soup for me. Cornish crab soup. What's your main course then?
Pork, please. Pork with masala.
And I'll have the venison with black cherries, please. What are the vegetables?
And vegetables today, new potatoes, carrots and French beans.
Lovely.
That sounds nice.
Cheers.
Cheers. Eating out in this sort of style usually means a hefty bill at the end of it all. But my dinner partner, Drew Smith, who's the editor of the Good Food Guide, argues that all too often the food served in restaurants is not worth the money. Smells terrific. All sorts of convenience foods which require no skill from the chef are now being used in restaurant kitchens, frequently disguised in the dining room by posh menus. So it's a 2-week waiting list before you can actually get a table, is it?
Yes, no, it's ring up about 10 o'clock in the morning. And if it's 10:15, you probably missed it.
What, to confirm? At 10:15?
It's like, yes, watch call. Oh, no, it's got I think actually...
According to Drew Smith, sophisticated catering packs of haute cuisine dishes are now being served in as many as 70% of restaurants and hotels across the country.
Food like this actually appears on restaurant menus and pub menus across the entire country. And the interesting thing is, I mean, this meal, if we'd gone out to the supermarket, I could have bought it for £2.78p. But in a restaurant with the candles and with everything, I might well be charged £15. I might be charged £20. And I think that's wrong.
Well, we're not actually in a restaurant. We've been taking part in a little experiment, a little demonstration, to show how easy it is when you go out for a meal and expect something special that you think someone's put a lot of time into, to be fooled by the menu and the way that food is described, when actually what you're getting is something that might have been boiled in the bag or something that's come out of a can. And these are the kinds of foods that you might find being served in restaurants these days. Isn't that right, Drew?
Absolutely. I mean, we've got things here, and there's nothing wrong with them in themselves if you were to take them home and eat them for yourself if you chose to do that. But I think that what is wrong is the fact that if you go to a restaurant, you can't honestly know what on earth you are eating. And even, quite sophisticated experts. Some of my inspectors wouldn't necessarily catch all of this. But at the same time, I mean, if you worry about what you do eat, for instance, I mean, it's called real game soup. I mean, what is real about this? And the confusing thing also is if you look at the ingredients here, this isn't actually a game soup at all. It's a venison soup. There's more butter in here than there is hare or pheasant. It also contains something which sounds quite wonderfully awful, like hydrolyzed vegetable protein. And it's also got caramel in it. And if I wanted to eat caramel in my soup, I probably would do. I mean, I wouldn't do that sort of thing at home. And there's no way of finding out if somebody's going to serve this soup in a restaurant.
But aren't these just the tricks of the trade that people have come to expect, and they know that they go on, but they're not really that bothered about it?
Well, I think you could be bothered about it if these things were actually good enough. But the simple fact is that you can go to the supermarket and you can buy it for half the price, a quarter of the price. So why should you eat the same thing when you go out?
The range of foods available to caterers in this form is very wide and comes from a handful of suppliers, so it's easy to see why the likes of Black Forest Gâteau and Coq au Vin appear so frequently on menus right across the country. What do you think are the telltale signs then that you can show the difference between the one that uses the processed packaged foods and the one that uses the fresh food?
Well, I think it's so sophisticated that it's very difficult to tell. I don't think I could tell from reading a menu anymore. I mean, there are certain dishes which come up, and it's a bit unfair to presume that automatically they're going to be processed, but they very frequently will be. Things like duck à l'orange, bœuf bourguignon, chicken Kiev, sole normande, all those kind of things very often can be.
The convenience food, a triumph of modern civilization. A few cents worth of something healthy like corn or vegetables, some sugar, which adds a lot of calories and may cause cavities in your teeth, salt, which can help make your blood pressure higher, and possibly some fat, adding still more calories and increasing the risk of heart disease. When you pay the price for convenience, don't forget the cost to your health.
How strange to see messages like that emerging from the same nation that first spawned fast food. Dr. Jeffrey Bland, the American nutritionist, has been watching the growth in fast food that is healthier.
It has been amazing to me the last decade to watch what's happening in the United States with regard to our average diet. Where 10 years ago, the American dream, eating-wise, was the burger, the shake, the Pepsi, the fries, and the apple pie on the run, generally in your car, eaten hand-to-mouth to the next supermarket or shopping center. We're now seeing major fast food establishments develop in their menu offerings a range of things from salad bars to vegetable-based protein meals to all sorts of alternatives of chicken and fish, which are basically coming out of a consumer pressure to say, I won't tolerate just burgers any longer, and those companies that only offer burgers are going to go financially belly up. And as a result of that, there are considerable changes in the average adult and child's diet, knowing that many of the adolescents sort of live on fast foods. I think we're redefining fast foods in the United States, and that is a nice mirror of what's happening in the total dietary intake of the American diet.
But how far is that intake a mirror of what the customer wants to buy? Is consumer pressure the key to the diet of the future?
Most definitely, and I think that what we see are the consumers being the major vehicle for change of the food supply and food production companies. They are really effective in putting pressure on those people who are there to make a profit in the sale of their foods and will respond to consumer demands.
I think that there's no doubt at all that consumers are increasingly interested in the health effects of eating. You just look at wholemeal bread, consumption increasing, low-fat milk, the shift in margarines, the shift from butter, the shift towards high-fiber cereals, very, very marked changes. And together with that, consumers are wanting more information about what's in their products. Now, the Food Standards Committee, which advises the Minister of Agriculture, several years ago recommended that we do have in this country nutritional labelling of foods. This has not been acted upon by the Ministry as yet. I suspect this may change in the very near future, not least of which, as a reason, is that if you look at all of the medical reports that have been produced in this country advising that we do eat a healthier diet, they are all recommending that we must have better labelling of foods to enable us to use our growing level of awareness about health and food.
But how can the consumer obtain that right information? If you're buying meat for the weekend or choosing fruit for the family, everyone needs to know what foods are best. Next week, we will look at some of the diet and health campaigns from other countries and examine whether, in this crucial area of public health, in Britain, we may be lagging behind.